So we got through the first 10 verses of Genesis chapter 39 last week. So we're talking about Joseph's life. We don't know exactly where Joseph ended up when he went to Egypt. The marker there, the little red dot, is actually Goshen, which is where his family would settle years into the future. But repeatedly within the context of his story, God was with him is repeated. And we were talking about the idea of what difference does that truth make to us? Our actions, our choices, our thoughts, our responses. They clearly made an impact on Joseph. They clearly made a difference. And we don't even know whether he just accepted this fact or whether God communicated with him that in a special way that he was with him. Joseph arrives as a 17-year-old in Egypt. And he could have been angry, he could have been bitter, he could have been depressed, discouraged, defeated, despondent. But what does this 17-year-old do? He works hard. He shows character, he shows godliness, he shows diligence. Which one of those responses would be yours? Would it be the one Joseph rejected or the one he chose? I know sometimes we do either or, but think about what you would have done and how we respond to situations that are challenging in our lives. Do we respond like Joseph or do we respond differently? And recognize that not only is the picture of God's sovereignty and God protecting and preparing Egypt and bringing the nation down all part of the story, but Joseph's story, when it was told and it was heard either by fellow slaves or other people after the fact, should and did and does impact them. How does our story, how does people hearing and seeing our story impact them? We recognize that because Joseph chose to do what was right, chose to live right, God blessed his master Potiphar. But then we met Mrs. Potiphar, who doesn't have a name, just Potiphar's wife. She wants to have an affair with Joseph. And he focuses on the fact that this is wrong. It is wrong against Potiphar, and it is wrong ultimately against God. Not normally how we view sin. We normally think of sin or what is going to happen if I get caught. What are the consequences rather than who I'm actually sinning against. And interestingly, Joseph didn't just say no once. The idea or the context says day after day she kept after him. And how often or how easy is it to say no? The first time, the 10th time, the 100th time, the 1000th time. But Joseph continued to say no. He sets a strong example to us, a challenge to us to say no to sin on a daily basis. And I think I put this quote up here. I used this quote last week in the evening and this morning in the morning service. Character isn't created in the moment of adversity. Character is revealed. Joseph made these decisions long before Mrs. Potiphar came and propositioned him. He had committed to do what was right, and he stuck by that. And I left you with the thought or the idea that character takes a long time and effort to build and only a moment to lose. And Joseph chose to not lose it in the moment. So we left him in that situation in verse 10. So we're going to pick up in verse 11 of Genesis 39. 11 and 12 says, "But it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work. None of the men of the house, were inside. And she, talking about Potiphar's wife, caught him by his garment, saying, 'Lie with me.' But he left his garment in her hand and fled and ran outside." So the proposition has not worked. Time after time after time, Joseph said no. What is Mrs. Potiphar's new strategy? Plant evidence. Well, she wasn't hoping to plant evidence. That was the what she's going to do because she has no other recourse. But what was she hoping Joseph was going to do to her grabbing and trying to force him to have sex? Give in. He's hoping he's going to give in. Notice that Joseph was not doing anything wrong. He's in the house fulfilling his responsibilities, and she has chosen to take advantage of them, the fact that he is doing his job and there's no one else around. What does Joseph do to her second method of trying to seduce him? Runs away without his coat. Sometimes the only option is to walk away or to run away from sin. And obviously this applies to sexual sin, and the New Testament says flee sexual immorality. But there's other things that it's just better to walk away from than spend time with, because you know you may give in. So sometimes the best option is to walk away, to flee from sin, and that's what Joseph does. What did we just see Potiphar had given into Joseph's hand? Remember, hand and things like that are repeated in the story. Well, that's what Joseph left. But before she started propositioning him, what did Potiphar give into Joseph's hand? What was he responsible for? Everything. So Joseph had everything in his hand except what Potiphar had to eat and his wife. Now, as someone just said, Joseph's coat is in Potiphar's wife's hand. So now she's stuck with no man and only a jacket or a coat. So it was, verse 13, and so it was that when she saw he had left his garment in her hand and fled, she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, I had a conversation with someone when we were studying this particular passage in the context of the Hebrew in seminary, and they said that you can interpret her calling out as to a how did he put it? I'm going to remember here. A cry of rage and frustration that she didn't get what she wanted, and that's what attracted everybody. So that's a kind of interesting perspective, but she was frustrated that this young man had such morals, such scruples, such character that she could not bend him to her will. But she calls out to the men of her house, spoke to them, saying, see, he, talking about Potiphar, has brought to us a Hebrew to mock us. He came to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened when he heard me lift up my voice and cry out that he left his garment and fled and went outside. So the scream of frustration brings men running, and what does she tell them? She blames it on Potiphar, which is really interesting. The men who are there are Joseph's compatriots, they're slaves, and she's blaming it on their master. What else does she tell them? She turns the whole thing around. Yeah, what happened in that room where no one else was? According to Mrs. Potiphar. Attempted rape, which is actually pretty close, but the offender was not Joseph, it was her. Interestingly, she still has, the picture here is she's holding on to this cloak. She has not set it down yet. She's still holding it in her hand. Look at verse 16. So she kept the garment with her until his master came home. Why is she so attached to this garment? Okay, she can't have him. The only thing she could get a hold of was that, so she got something out of the deal. What do you think Potiphar, how do you think Potiphar views Joseph, thinks about him? So he has a pretty high regard for Joseph. He trusted him with everything he owns, basically. So if his wife tells him that Joseph tried this, what is he going to ask for? Proof, yeah. That's why she's not letting that thing go, because this is the only leverage she has in all of this. Because otherwise it's his word against hers, and we know what kind of character Joseph has. I don't know we don't know if this was a one-time thing with her or whether she had a habit of this that her husband was aware of. I don't know. But she's holding on to that for proof that her side is going to be heard and she's going to prevail in the argument. So she's sitting there and keeping his garment with her until Potiphar comes home. Then she spoke with him with words like these, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came in to me to mock me." So now, she's still blaming Potiphar, but who's getting mocked? She is. Before it was the whole household. But now it's her being mocked by his choice of slave. Not just his choice of slave, but because he was a Hebrew. So, verse 18, "So it happened, as I lifted up my voice to cry out, that he left his garment with me and fled outside." So, Potiphar has a choice at this point. What are his two options in this situation? Well, he probably has more than one, but two obvious options. Believe her, or if he doesn't believe her, that means he's believing Joseph. Interestingly, Joseph is never questioned in all of this, so he takes her word for it. He believes. What's that?
Were slaves or servants in that time, like African American slaves in America? I mean, you never believed it was always the master's word was correct.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to how slaves were viewed in terms of legalities and believabilities, but if he was an average slave, I think that's a different situation. But with the character he has displayed and the responsibility he has, there has to be some level of trust in Joseph's word. But he doesn't even question Joseph. Here's what he does. Verse 19, "So it was when his master heard these words, which his wife spoke to him, saying, 'Your servant did to me after this manner,' that his anger was aroused." How does Potiphar respond to his wife's information? He was mad. Yeah, that I've heard that question before, and I think that's a valid one. Is he angry with her because he's cost him a slave who has done a great job and God has blessed his household, or is he really angry with Joseph? But interestingly, look at verse 19. When he says, "So it was, and the master heard the words of his wife," he says, "Your servant." She is again talking about him as Potiphar's choice. It's your fault I'm in this situation. So he has a choice. He had a choice. Believe Joseph, believe his wife. He chooses to believe his wife. Right, obviously wrong, but we don't know whether he knew all of the facts of what kind of woman she was. "Then Joseph's master," verse 20, "took him and put him into prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison." What does Potiphar choose to do with Joseph? Get him out of the way. Send him to prison. What options were available to Potiphar to deal with Joseph? Yeah, pretty much he had the right to kill Joseph. So the question remains, or the question I have is, why did he choose prison over death for Joseph? Reasonable doubt. That idea probably didn't exist then, but the principle is there. Do I really believe that Joseph did this? If I don't, how can I punish him to make my wife happy, but not kill him because I don't believe he really did that? So again, he has the option, but I think also the next part, verse 21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph." This is all under God's control. God's sovereign. He is shaping Joseph's path to get him in the right place at the right time for what he has planned. So that is another reason that Potiphar chooses that, is because that was God's will. He is in prison. The Lord is with him. And how many times do you think yourself in prison and the Lord is with you? But that's what it says. And it says, the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy. He gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. So what does God demonstrate towards Joseph? I believe in you. Okay. New King James says mercy. Other translations. Steadfast love. All right, Hebrew scholars, what word is this? Hesed, covenantal faithfulness, covenantal loyalty. The covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he is keeping Joseph alive. He is keeping him safe. He is preparing him for what is coming. Whether Joseph knows it or not at this point, God is working behind the scenes. And he does that by saying that he gave him favor, or he found grace in the sight of the keeper of the prison. Again, God allowing him protection. What prison was Joseph put in? The king's prison. Okay? Not just a prison, not just some prison, but the king's prison, which is going to play into chapter 40, chapter 41. If Potiphar didn't place him there, he would not meet the cupbearer and the baker. He would not be prepared to go see Pharaoh and talk about dreams. God is with Joseph. He is working behind the scenes. Joseph obviously is not going to know that part until much later. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. What happens when Joseph gets into prison? Brings his leadership skills. He brings his character. He brings his work ethic. He brings his temperament. He brings all of what he did in Potiphar. He just transfers it into the prison and starts doing it there. And it gets noticed. Just like Potiphar, the keeper of the prison, the warden, pays attention and sees there's something different about this guy. You know, how many times does a prisoner get trusted with other prisoners? It doesn't make sense, right? They're all guilty. They're all in there for the wrong reasons. Not Joseph. The idea is that his character shows up again. You know, here's a young man who is, we don't know how long at this point. In a little bit, we're going to figure out where he is in age, but he's somewhere between 17 and 28 at this point. He's been sold as a slave. He's been a slave, has done a good job, been rewarded. He's been falsely accused. He's been thrown in prison. He's done it all over again. Would you be willing to do it the second time? You know, it's one thing to do it in Potiphar's house, saying, I'm going to make the best of a bad situation. But now he's in prison, falsely accused, and he says, I don't want to do it anymore. No, he does it all again. He continues to do what's right, and God honors that. So before we go on to the next section of Joseph's life, the dreams that he interprets for the first time in prison, thoughts, comments, questions about chapter 39? All right. Hearing none, no objections, we're going to move on, starting to chapter 40. And it came to pass after these things. So at some point, we don't know how long Joseph's been in prison. We don't know how long he's been even in Egypt. By the end of chapter 41 or 40, we're going to know that he's 30 or he's 28. Because then in 41, he comes out, and we find out he interprets, and we find out he is now 30. So somewhere in that time frame. So he's there for an undetermined period of time. After these things, after Joseph was thrown in, after he's given the responsibilities, it says it came to pass that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his officers, the chief butler and the chief baker. So he put them into custody in the house of the captain of the guard, in the prison, the place where Joseph was confined. So I have a little slide here, I think. So at the beginning of chapter 1, or chapter 41, we're going to find out he's 28, and that he waits 2 years to be remembered by the butler, and he turns 30. So somewhere between 17 and 28, Joseph is in prison. We've already covered and reminded ourselves all those things that he's done. What might Joseph be thinking if he has been now in Egypt for 10 or 11 years, been a slave, now imprisoned? What might he be thinking about everything that's going on since his brothers sold him? Maybe I should ask you, what would you be thinking? God hates me. I'm with Jim. When is the dream going to come true? Yeah. You know, we repeatedly hear the Lord is with him, the Lord is with him. I would say, really, Lord, where are you in all this? And then, how am I in prison going to see my brothers and my parents bowing before me? In the midst of this, we don't get the idea that he's thinking this way, but I certainly would be. As he's been there for a while, who shows up being put in prison where Joseph is? The butler and the baker and the candle. No, anyway. Okay, so some translations will say cupbearer or butler as opposed to butler. Who was this man? Right-hand man of the Pharaoh. What responsibilities did he have? Test the food. He drank everything. He tested whatever Pharaoh drank, tested whatever Pharaoh ate. So if someone tried to poison Pharaoh, he's going to get it first. So he obviously, like Joseph, there has to be a lot of trust in this man. And the other individual is just simply a baker. What might these two men be worried about if Pharaoh is angry and throws them into prison? Yeah, am I going to get out with my head attached? Am I going to get out alive? Why were these men thrown in prison? We don't know specifically, but what does it say? They offended. They offended. Now, keep that in mind when you go forward, and Joseph goes before this man in a chapter in 2 years and he says, I hear you can interpret dreams. He goes, no, I can't. You know, seriously. These guys probably explained to him how serious, how easily it is to offend Pharaoh. Interestingly, they weren't thrown into just a prison. They were thrown into the prison where Joseph was. The same part. And we already know from the end of chapter 39, what was Joseph's responsibility for the people that were in that part of the prison? He was in charge of all of them. So he's going to be responsible for these men. Have time to get to know them. Verse 4, in fact, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them, so they were in custody for a while. How long was Joseph around these men? A while. So it wasn't just, sometimes when we tell this story or we teach it in Sunday school, it's like they got thrown in, and the first night they're there, they have the dreams and Joseph interprets them. But that's not the context. There was a time period, undetermined that they were there before they have the dream and before Joseph interprets. So there's a time period there, and then verse 5. Then the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in prison, had a dream. Both of them, each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation. So, they're there for a while, and they each have a dream. And we know that Joseph's connected with dreams, so we're kind of interested in seeing how God's going to work this out. Verse 6, Joseph came in to them in the morning, looked at them, and saw they were sad. What does that tell you about Joseph? He's compassionate. He's observant. He pays attention. He knew these men well enough to understand what they were normally like, and something was different. What does that tell you about how he treated fellow prisoners? Is it a personal relation? Yeah, it wasn't. He didn't treat them like slaves or lord it over the fact that he's in this position and they're beneath him. He's concerned about them. These are prisoners. Some of them may never get out. Some of them are going to go and suffer capital punishment and be killed. But he cares about them. He's concerned about them. How does this compare with our care and concern for other people? Are we like Joseph in that we know people well enough to know when they're struggling and that we're concerned about them when they are? So Joseph notices, and then he says, so he said to Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody of his Lord's house, saying, why do you look so sad today? Not only does Joseph notice, what else does he do? He asks. So I'm going to, because someone wouldn't give me a prize this morning, I'm going to get even.
What's the matter? You look sad.
No. My wife and I often have this conversation. She will talk to someone and I say, who is that? I have no idea. Because she won't ask. Well, I should know you, but I can't remember. Joseph was willing not only to notice and be concerned, to take the next step and go talk and not just walk by the cell and go, yeah, something's going on with those guys, and just keep walking to do his job. He stops, he takes time out, and he's willing to ask questions and say, hey, what's going on? Why don't we do that? Why don't we stop and ask questions when we notice things? You might have to do something. My wife doesn't ask because she might be embarrassed that she doesn't remember. Okay, sometimes it's embarrassing to ask, right? Now, let's turn it around. If someone were to ask you, hey, you don't look like you're doing so well. You look like you're upset. What may be your normal response? I'm fine. Okay, it depends on who's asking. And I take it from the context that Joseph had a relationship with these men. It wasn't a stranger. But most of the time, I think my response would be Althea's response. I'm fine. Why would we bother? Why would we, frankly, lie rather than tell someone the truth? You have to be vulnerable. We don't know the four rules of communication, one of which is be honest.
Because we're Christians, and sometimes I would want people to know we are down or having a sad day or anything.
And we are supposed to be different, but that doesn't mean we're immune to problems. How we handle them is different. So, the challenge is from both sides here, from Joseph to say, am I willing to ask? Am I willing to make myself uncomfortable and be concerned about someone else? And then if someone is willing to ask us, Am I willing to be honest? Even if it's to say, you know what, I'm going through some stuff. If you could pray for me, that'd be great. Or maybe we could talk later. Because sometimes they ask us in a context where you can't explain it, or you don't have time to. But rather than doing the I'm okay, are we willing to be honest? Because that's what the men are going to do here. We won't get to that tonight. They're going to tell Joseph what is going on, why they're sad, why they're having a difficult time. Thoughts, questions about the end of chapter 39 and just the first few verses of chapter 40 before we close in prayer? Well, the coat of many colors is probably in rough shape. It's a decade old and covered in blood, but yeah. I got nothing, Mary. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective to think about some of those things. Other thoughts? Yeah, that's correct. If she might have thought he would sneak you back in and take it, and then she has no evidence. Rob, I think you raised your hand.
I didn't realize, at least in my Bible, the way it's written, in verse 2, that the baker and the butler were actually the chief of those groups, because the least weights were here. And so, in a sense, they might not have done something wrong, but they might have been, maybe somebody underneath them might have done something that was unacceptable, and because they were overseers. I don't know.
No, and that's entirely, entirely possible that if they oversaw other men and they were accountable for what they did, they might be suffering not specifically for something they did, but for something that their staff or their helpers did. It's not clear, but ultimately the baker is going to, pay with his life for either what he did or for what other bakers did. So, anything else?
I think it's interesting that Potiphar's wife twice refers to Joseph's action as mocking. And I think probably she was used to getting what she wanted. And the other thing that she refers to is that he is not of their nation.
Mm-hmm.
He is a foreigner. He is, in the caste system, he's nothing. And he should be groveling at her feet. And that incenses her. And that's what motivates her.
Yeah, I agree that she, no doubt, especially from slaves, expected obedience, period. And there were probably pretty severe consequences without. And to have someone in that situation of that nature stand up to her and say no, that added to the whole insult that, not only he wouldn't do it, but that he would dare to not obey her. So.
Potiphar also could have put in a good word to the jailer.
Yeah, we don't know if Potiphar did something behind the scenes for Joseph, but it certainly seems like that his character, again, was very prominent, observed by others. I was going to say Leah. Sarah.
I think it's interesting. I'm not sure where the turnaround came in Joseph's life. I don't know when he was separated from his family, all of a sudden he had to call out to God, because I feel like the first part of his life he would not be looking at this and being like, you should be a whiny, spoiled, youngest child. But then all of a sudden, like, he gained leadership skills and, just different things that certainly were not displayed early on.
Yeah, and as you look at what God has done, whether you take the approach that he was spoiled and self-righteous and a little brat in the beginning or not, some people differ on that. Clearly God is shaping and preparing him. This is what a leader does. A leader leads even when it's hard. A leader leads even when situations aren't going the way you want. you stick to your principles, you stick to the truth, and God will reward you. But yeah, there's certainly a process of development of Joseph and preparing him and his character for what's going to happen in chapter 41, where God is going to move him from the prison to number 2 in Egypt. You know, there's not a stepping stone, there's nothing in between. Pharaoh just says, okay, you're the guy, and turns him loose. And says, here, you're speaking for me, you're speaking as me, what you say goes. Anything else? All right, well, let's pray, and we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for the example Joseph set. It is a high bar, and we know that he was not perfect in any way, but we recognize that he had immense strength of character, immense obedience to you, more so than we often have. Lord, help us to learn from Joseph, even when it's hard, even when we do what's right and we suffer negative consequences, not to give up, but to continue to choose to do what's right, what honors you, and recognize that you will, you see what we do, and you will reward us. Lord, we thank you for Joseph as a young man, setting the character and example for us. Help us to learn from it. Help us to be like him this week, to choose to do what's right, choose to do what would honor you, no matter who's watching or what the consequences are. We thank you for this. We thank you for the opportunity to spend time in your word together this evening. We ask this all in your name.